I'm Dr. Ralph Ford, Chancellor of Penn State Behrend, and you are listening to Behrend Talks. My guest today is Dr. Joe Beilein, a professor of history and the author of the new book, Vision Resilience, which explores the history of Penn State Behrend from 1980 to 2010. Welcome to the show, Joe.
I'm very happy to be here and looking forward to a fun conversation.
Well, likewise, and I'm going to go through what I traditionally do, which is a little bit of your background. You have a PhD and master's degree in American history from the University of Missouri. Maybe you'd say it a little differently, Missouri, and a bachelor's in history from Kenyon College. You are a noted Civil War historian, specializing in the study of guerrilla warfare, gender and violence. Some really nice book names here. A Man by Any Other Name, William Contrell and the Search for American Manhood. Second book, William Gregg's Civil War. And then Bushwhackers, your most recent one, Guerrilla War, Manhood, and the Household in Civil War, Missouri. You've also appeared, and we can't go without talking about your celebrity interactions here. You've been on the Learning Channel, the Celebrity Genealogy Show. Who do you think you are? Where you trace the family lineages of actresses Jessica Biel and Megan Mullally. So whole lot of different things there. Welcome here again.
Yeah, no, that's you nailed the bio. Thank you, Ralph.
All right. Well, let's talk about why'd you become a historian?
Well, as a kid, I always loved history, and I think a lot of us can do this with our profession. You can sort of like trace it back to when you're really, really young. But I loved history, and I think it was whether it was like World War II movies or different books. I remember having like a book about Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys, and just all sorts of stuff. So I always loved it. And then when I went to college, I decided to major in history despite the grumbles of my mother, who wanted me to major in econ, something that would actually, Your
parents said, don't do it.
Yes, exactly. They said, we're not paying this tuition for you to, go do what you love. No, I'm joking. They were supportive, but I liked the history professors too. And so I sort of switched over very early on from econ to history. And at that point, just kind of fell in love with it.
And why Civil War?
Sort of a strategic choice when I was deciding on I think I'd made my decision to go to graduate school, but I was trying to figure out exactly what I would focus on, and it was sort of between World War II and the Civil War. And my undergraduate advisor, Will Scott, made a very pragmatic and strategic decision for me. He basically did the math in his head and said, okay, when you're coming out with your PhD, it's going to be right around the sesquicentennial of the Civil War. So there's a chance there'll be more jobs available at that moment.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I was like,
see, it was a career decision.
Yeah. And so it really was. He's like, if it doesn't matter, if you love both of these things and you want to just go. And so that's what determined it. So that's why I ended up with Civil War history as my pursuit. And I'm so happy because I look at what my fellow colleague Amy Carney does, and she can speak several languages, and there's no way I would have been able to learn German or Italian or French and be able to do both sides of the war and all that stuff. So thank goodness I ended up with the American Civil War.
And where did you grow up? Are you from Missouri?
I'm from St. Louis originally.
Okay.
Yeah, so St. Louis is sort of a sterile bubble when it comes to the Civil War. It's not really northern, not really southern. There's not a lot of feeling about it. But obviously in the outer parts of the state, there's a lot of sentiment about the Civil War. And my mom's originally from southern Missouri. So there is this sort of history that I could kind of feel and understand on a visceral level.
Well, it is, the place of the Missouri Compromise, right?
Well, when it came into the Union, there was trouble, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
So let's talk about manhood, which shows up in the title. So what exactly, so in that space, what are you looking at there?
Well, just to offer a bit of background and context, there's a lot of straightforward military and political histories of the Civil War, but beginning in probably the 80s really is where these scholars hit their stride. People started to look at other aspects of the war, taking the angle of race or social class or gender in my case. And with gender, a lot of the early focus, although not exclusively, but a lot of the early focus was on women. Mm-hmm. And then, in getting into gender relations. And then later on in the early 2000s, sort of right around the time I started graduate school, a few scholars started to look more specifically at men and how they understood themselves as men. And it was sort of like the flip side of the coin, right? There's both, gender is not something that's exclusive to women. Men obviously have it too. And the more I read about it, the more I realized we could understand a lot about these people, not only their identities, but also getting into my research, you could understand more about how they fought the war, like literally the ways in which they fought or why they decided to fight, for the Confederacy or the North or whatever it was. So it opened up this way for me to answer questions that weren't just questions that were social and cultural questions, which are important to me, but you could answer questions that military scholars weren't able to answer because they had never taken this sort of more social or cultural history approach. So it was just fascinating, and obviously that's a unique time for American manhood, right? You've got Southerners, white Southerners think of themselves very differently than like urban Northern men, and stuff. So it's almost a contest of manhood in the war. So those are some of the reasons how I got into it. That makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And are you working on like a fourth book? Are you continuing research in this area?
Yeah. I actually just got great news. Literally minutes before I walked in here, I just got a great summer fellowship to go to the Buffalo Bill Cody Museum in Cody, Wyoming.
Wow.
So this summer, or I might break it up this summer or next summer, but my next project involves a lot of the guys who are on the opposite side of the bushwhackers of the Confederate guerrillas. I'm interested in the men who grew up in Kansas during Bleeding Kansas, became Jayhawkers or fought for the North during the war, and then continued on as scouts, as hunters for the U.S. Army, and participated in the wars against the Plains Indians. So, and the focus of that is very much going to be how these guys conceptualize themselves as men and all of that.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you. I'm pumped. Now we just got to figure out what we're going to do with 3 kids.
So
right? While I'm
you
gone
got
for
young
a month.
kids and 3 now.
Yeah.
Good for you.
And maybe they'll come with us. Who knows?
Well, how did you end up at Penn State Behrend?
When I was finishing up my graduate work, and I think other academics know this, you're on the job market, you're looking at what's out there, what's been posted, and there were a few jobs that were awesome, but were above what I was going to get coming out of the University of Missouri as someone without any established credentials. Like I remember applying for some reason for like a job at Princeton or Harvard, but you're just trying to like get, as many applications as you can. And so, but then
I applied to Caltech for grad school.
There you go.
Never heard from them.
They didn't have the decency to write me back.
Maybe they did. I can't remember.
So there was some of that. And then there were some other jobs that were really good jobs, but mostly teaching-oriented jobs. And then there's this sort of sweet spot, which I think where Behrend sits, which is we really value teaching, and that even became clear in the application. But also you were expected to do research. And I remember reading the posting, and I was like, Penn State Behrend, that sounds familiar. And I remembered that, and I want to be clear, there was no nepotism involved here, but I remembered that my second cousin, Dave Nyland, was the basketball coach here.
Oh, really? I did not know that.
And so it's sort of like, like set off like a little bit of like a ringing bell, and I was like, there's something about this place. And so I remembered hearing about it earlier. I didn't realize it was Penn State Behrend, but I knew that he worked at this college in Pennsylvania. And so I started to dig into it, and of course I called Dave and talked to Dave, and he was able to share a lot about the campus, and he had nothing but great things to say. So I applied for the job, and luckily they were looking for someone who could do what I did. I think I was replacing someone who taught the Civil War. Those were really popular classes, so they wanted a Civil War historian, some of the people on the faculty, and it was one of those things that just worked out. It was sort of like a really good fit for someone who really likes to teach, but also really likes to do research.
Do you have a favorite course you like to teach here?
I have too many favorites, probably. Yeah. There's some of the ones that I teach almost every year I really like, but of course I really like getting into the sort of upper division Civil War class. I just taught an upper division class on colonial American history, and I taught it for the first time, and I just said goodbye to the students, and it was sort of one of those like, this was a lot of fun. I also apologize. This is the first time I've taught this course, so you guys were here for the rough draft, But teaching new courses is awesome because you just learn a ton, too. They're a lot of work, but over the course of the semester, you're like learning kind of along with them. So I wouldn't say I have a favorite, but yeah, I've been lucky. I've taught mostly interesting stuff here.
And we're going to come back to teaching and what motivates you there. But I wanted to switch now to your book that is part of the subject of our discussion here today, which is something called Vision and Resilience. I think the story of the remarkable growth of Penn State Behrend, and it covers our history from 1980 to 2010. And I don't want to sound foolish and say, well, how did you get involved in this project, Dr. Beilein? Because as you well know, it was an idea that myself and others had, and I somehow one day knocked on your door and said, hey, I'm thinking about this. But why don't you talk about the genesis of this book project and what it's about?
Well, yeah. First off, I do want to talk briefly for that. I remember I came in here, and it was like, I think it was around this time of year. I feel like it was at the end of a year, and maybe I have it flipped. Maybe it was early August or something like that. But it was things were either shutting down or just starting. And I brought my dog to work, and I thought, all right, I got to get this thing into the building, get it in my office, and we're good to go. And I think I saw you at the very end of the hallway at Cockle, and I was like, damn it, the chancellor just saw me with my dog. And so you knocked on the door, of course. We're like the only two people in the building. And I was like, oh, hey, Ralph. And I had Double and our dog there. And that's when you sort of ran the idea by me. And I thought, well, I've got this illegal mammal on campus. I better say yes to this. Plus, it's the chancellor asking. But that's how I remember that.
Was I nice to your dog?
Oh, you were great. You were like, I think you said something like, sometimes I bring my dogs on campus.
I was going to just tell you, I've been known to bring my dog here.
Yeah.
It's on record now. So.
Yes, there you go. We're both in trouble. But no, so you brought the idea up, and then it sounded like, or the way I recall it, the former leader of the college, John Lilly, was very interested in this project. And we sort of started talking about it, and it just seemed like something that we could probably pull off, which writing and researching, writing, publishing a book is not the easiest thing to pull off, but I think we had enough people that were interested in this book succeeding. So that's just kind of how we got the ball rolling.
Well, I remember it as well. I don't actually quite remember coming to your office, so I've got to work on my memory banks on that one.
Well, you have nothing going on. You're not busy at all.
Or it could be other things started impinging on our memories. But the thing about writing this, I do remember this part about the discussions early on is you really thought about it, and you came back and you said, what kind of book? I mean, do you want the campy, I'm going to tell like the nice history, and it's going to be like the marketing piece? And you really wanted to, now I'm not saying we're writing, the history of, some historical period of the world that, you got to really be critical about, but you wanted to be critical in what you did, and you wanted to be real and honest and do the research and not just make it a fluff piece.
Sure.
And certainly it tells our story in a positive way, but not completely. I just wanted, what was your thought process as that got started?
Yeah, I mean, and this was, in all honesty, with the exception of like the time that goes into doing something like this, this was the hardest part, right? And because we sent drafts back and forth, and there were also other people that got involved, and so it was difficult. And I think some drafts were overly critical. Other drafts I felt like there was stuff that was too fluffy. And we did sort of kind of go back and forth, and you and I very politely disagreed on stuff. But we, more often than not, we were able to come to a consensus, right? Like you might say, like, well, that's not quite how that happened. And sometimes I go, oh, well, that's right. And then other times you'd say that's not quite how that happened. I'm like, well, actually, it kind of is how it happened.
It is, yeah.
And we would, but I think in the end, it had to be something that not only worked for me, it couldn't just be me standing on my principles as a historian, but it was a part of a larger project that we're doing here, which is, preserving the history of the college and telling it in a faithful way, but in a way that reflects the growth and all the good things that we've done here.
Yeah, and I think that your point about going back and forth, and I hope it was always, it made me go back and look at some things and try to find some of the facts. But you really did all of the research, and I think it was hopefully few and far between. But there were somewhere I still have, and as I told you, I've got it written, I've saved it, and I scribbled in there, and a little bit of smoke coming out of your ears. It didn't happen this way, and then you came back and said, yes, it did. All right, it happened that way. So I think it was a good process. But the credit goes to you and the students who did all the creative work. But I mean, one of the cool things about this was, from 1980 to 2010, for many who know who are listening to this probably, we had Jack Burke and John Lilly as the two leaders of campus. And you actually had access to both of them. You were able to talk to them and hear it firsthand. You don't always get that as a historian.
No. And frankly, it made me pretty uncomfortable on a certain level. I'm much more comfortable dealing with people who have been dead for 150 years. You can say a lot more about them, and there's no repercussions. But the flip side of that, I've thought about this a little bit. The flip side of that is, as a Civil War historian, of course, you're constantly thinking like, oh, if I could just get Lincoln in here for a sit down and run a couple things by him, I could finally get some clarity, right?
Yeah.
So you're always wishing that these people were alive and so you could talk to them. So it was tough. And it actually, like, Lily wanted to meet with me a couple times early on. And I remember just thinking, I don't really want to do it this way. I want Jane to do these oral interviews, and then I'll go through them. You know, that's the way historians work. We have documents, we sort of work through those. And then if I have like questions after the fact, it'll be great to ask those to John, but John wanted to sit down. And finally, after
Clearly, he wants to tell his story.
Totally.
Yeah.
And right. And also in a lot of ways, and I say this in the book, he is the source. Sometimes he was the only person in the room that's still here. Yeah. And so it was a challenge for me. And I think especially early on when, you know, Eric Cordy, the former leader of the School of H&SS, had this idea that this really needed to be, you know, a rigorous academic book. Mm-hmm. And that way it would count towards, you know, whatever promotion was going to be the next promotion. And I started off doing it that way, and it was just so hard to do that because I would have had to read this whole other canon of literature about, you know, higher ed and, you know, development and, you know, and all this stuff. And I read some of that stuff, but I was not prepared to do that. And I think it became a lot easier to not only write the book, but to engage directly with John and Jack Burke when I decided, okay, we're still going to stick to all the standards of good professional history, but it's not going to go through a rigorous peer review process, right? It's still going to go through an academic press, but this isn't going to be the sort of thing where I'm making revisions because I didn't include this book or that book in the historiographical chapter, you know, and all that. So when I was able to do that, I sort of engaged with them a little bit more as like I'm not a journalist. I don't hold myself to those standards. They're way better at this stuff than I am. But it was a little bit more of like a journalist interviewing them and being able to have my subject right there to get the information. And once I did that, it was great. And John, as you know, John's willing to talk about all the stuff, and Jack is, you know, great, and he's willing to talk about this stuff. So they were both incredibly helpful, sort of like, you know, finding the path through all this stuff.
What was the environment they walked into in 1980? What was it like here, from what you could see?
Yeah, I mean, the words that they use are words like dire, bleak. I think Lily came in prepared for it to be a bad situation. I think in a way, I don't know if he knew if he was going to move to, you know, he was a leader at Kansas State, but he wasn't the leader of Kansas State. I don't know if he thought his first job was going to be kind of like a place like this, where you're going to have to like build a place up. So he seemed like he knew it was bad, but he came in with sort of a game plan. He was going to get the community leaders involved, alums involved. You know, he had some allies down at University Park. And so he knew it was bad, but he seemed ready for the challenge. Jack Burke is so funny. He's like, you know, I didn't even tell my wife how bad it was because I wanted this job. And it's clear he believed in Lily, and he could sort of see it too. But for him, I think it was a little bit riskier because, you know, he wasn't coming to take over this place. He was going to help this guy who had just taken over this place. And he had a good job, you know, up in the SUNY system. And so for him, it felt a lot riskier, I think. Like he was walking in and like they might be packing their bags. And you know, in academia, it's sometimes you've got a good job. It's a big risk to go somewhere else because you might have to be totally starting over. And if you lose that job, then there's no,
the story you're told about and what you walk into, you really don't know.
Right.
And you might end up with a board or,
Totally.
And then you're out the door in 6 months.
Yeah. So it was not a good situation, and it's unclear what Penn State thought was going to happen because they gave this place, you know, 4-year college status a few years earlier in the 70s, and I don't think they were sure how this was all supposed to work. So just the whole thing was kind of messy and difficult, but they believed in it or believed in this vision for this place.
We talk a lot about John Lilly, but go a little further on Jack Burke. What was the dynamic between the two? How did it work between those two?
Yeah, I mean, Lilly is definitely the vision guy. Not to say that Burke doesn't have, you know, a vision or didn't see the vision for this place. He did, but I think when they were at their best, Lilly had a vision and he was looking out. You know, he was sort of constantly thinking about development, buying up more land for the school. You know, how are we going to do this bigger thing? And Burke was the one who was working behind the scenes. You know, there's stories that I found in the newspapers or even talking to them or other sources where they'd end up with a problem, and it might be a good problem. Like they might not have enough beds for the freshmen coming in. And Burke would have a few weeks to figure that out, and he'd figure it out. But other people I could see being presented with that issue, like, hey, our incoming class is actually too big. We can't get them on campus. And that might lead to just a panic. But Burke was very cool and calm, and I think he tucked himself away in his office. And he was in control of all the finances, so he had that part figured out. And he'd get on the phone, or he'd get out there and he'd come up with a solution. So he's constantly the one who was putting out crises they couldn't foresee, and then also the ones that Lilly would sort of accidentally create by saying, we put in an offer on this house, or right, or we've got this. I created some sort of an issue at University Park, or maybe University Park created the issue, and I can't figure a way out of this, so we've all got to go down there and figure it out. So he was definitely the one who got things done.
Yeah,
here's a problem, please solve it.
He was the operations guy, but also everyone respected and liked him, and I think you hit that exactly. And so, if we switch as well, one of the things that John did when he came in immediately, or soon thereafter, according to the book, was he started to reach out to people in the community, and he saw that as really important, and fundraising becomes a key part of his legacy. Can you talk us about how did that evolve?
Yeah. When he was interviewing, the story goes, he wanted to meet with some local leaders who were also either alums or had a connection to Penn State in some way, shape, or form. And he met with Ted Junker and Tom Hagen, I think, at the Erie Club. And this was during the interviewing process. And he basically said, if I come, will you guys help me? And Hagen had already been involved in doing some fundraising here. And, Ted Junker was I think, happy to help. I'm sure he had already been involved as well. And that was kind of how this whole thing started. And they introduced him to people, and to Lilly's credit, he followed through on all those relationships and meetings and things like that. And he was sort of able to build this network that grew and grew and grew. And he reconfigured I can't remember the names, but was he the one that took it from the Board of Trustees to the Council of Fellows?
That's correct. Council of Fellows. Yep.
So he rebuilt that.
Yeah.
A lot of the same people came over, but there were new people and maybe people who weren't involved anymore. And he also saw, I think, the talent that different people had. And so Tom Hagen was running the Council of Fellows. He was like the chair, and so he was running these campaigns to raise huge amounts of money for the time, like $5-6 million. Maybe it started off as 2, and then it became 5, and said maybe we can raise 10. And that's what he was doing. And Ted Junker was just like, he was the man on the ground everywhere. If you go back and look through the photo albums, he is in the background of every picture, or like in the foreground, smiling and shaking someone's hand.
He's the ultimate connector.
Ultimate connector.
Yeah.
And so he obviously, Lilly recognized that about him, though, right? Like, this is how this guy can help me. And Ted obviously was happy to help that way. And this is how Tom can help me. And he was happy to help that way. And Susie Hurt Hagen became a huge, advocate for the school and a huge help. And so he just sort of like kept these people involved.
He did, and talking about Ted Junker, he was a banker, right? Vice president or regional president of PNC. And I will tell this story. He just a few months before he passed away, I was able to have dinner with him at my house, and Joe Prishak, who was
Nice.
from Plastic, and they told me the story of how plastics came to be at Behrend, which was basically Joe Prishak was saying, I can't find any talent here, and Ted Junker said, I know where we're going to go. And he connected him to John Lilly. And I mean, that is truly how it started. The idea had been floating around, but no one could make it happen for quite some time.
Yeah.
And that's how it started.
That's great. That's great. And that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, it was. So let's talk about what were a few of the big milestones that happened from,
So in terms of just the history from 80 to 2010, I mean, there are a lot of them, as we know. I think getting rid of most of the trailers, not to start with but like stuff like that. The engineering complex, which is now the science complex over there, was a big deal. The Cockle building, and Cockle and Lilly Library, was probably incredibly modern, for the time, and still is a nice building. And so building the buildings was a big deal. Buying up all this land, the athletics center, when that finally got built, which is now, of course, the Junker Center, and now we have a second one, right, for the students. So those are a lot of landmarks. I also think, as they passed these different enrollment numbers, I think when Lily came in, it was around 1,200 students, maybe something like that, 250 maybe juniors and seniors, and then you get to a couple thousand within a few years, and I think by the end of the 90s, they were right around 4,000. So all those were big watershed moments. And then there's other ways to look at it, too. I mean, there's these curricular moments, too, right? We go from the 2-year engineering program to the 4-year engineering program, which is happening while they're getting all of these people who helped build the engineering complex together, the Preshaks and Fasenmeyer and Zern, and all these folks together. That's all happening in the mid to late 80s, and then I'm trying to think here. You have the schools, right? These curricular
Schools
things.
are created. Yeah.
Schools are created. Lily was really big on, and this was sort of a fad, but not a fad. That's the wrong word because fads go away. But there was a lot trending towards business schools in the late 80s. And so he decided we have a business program, we need to have a business school that's off on its own. So, I mean, there's all sorts of things that you could say were watershed moments or big moments in the development of this place.
Well, I think that's a good summary of a number of them. In this book, in writing it, you hired a number of student researchers, had them involved.
Yep.
How were they involved, and what did they find?
So in terms of doing the research, I hired 3 students at different points in the process. And what I wanted them to do, I had one of them sort of do 2 things. First, he kind of was working alongside me. This is at the very beginning. So he helped me kind of figure out the larger contours of the story. And then towards the end of his time with me, I set him on this track of, tell me what student life was like. And so he did a little bit of that, and then he graduated and went on his way. And then I hired a couple more students to carry on with that. And basically their job was to look through the newspapers and then anywhere else it took them to tell me what it was like to be a student here. And this is one of the difficult things about writing a book like this, is you have so many different forces here. You have the leaders of the college, you have the partners, from the community, you have Penn State University, you have the faculty, but I kept coming back to me, the students are what matter here, right? They're not only what we produce, but they're also the means of production in this place in a lot of ways, and the reason why we're all here. And so I thought we should have students do the research about the students. And so they did a lot of the stuff, and I told them to find what was interesting and then sort of write up how this fits together in your own words. And I was hoping that, I don't know why I was hoping this, but I kind of was hoping that it would be a more whimsical part of the book. But these 3 students kept coming back with all these really serious social and political issues. And it's so funny because I don't think many of us think of Penn State Behrend as being this very rabid political campus, right? But what occurred to me, and I didn't talk about this book, what occurred to me is the student newspaper back in the day was the way in which people expressed their views. And they wrote back to each other, and it was almost like Twitter, but where people were sort of going back and forth. You just had to wait a week to hear the response. You had to wait a week
for the response. That's
right. And so they weren't, and it's a very Midwestern thing, right? There weren't students confronting each other on campus. Instead, they're in their dorm room and they're writing about it, and they have their own friends that believe in what they're saying, and then someone else would write back. And it's not passive aggressive, but it's also I don't want to get into a verbal altercation with this person. And so, and I just see that as sort of a Midwestern way. I was at the University of Missouri for graduate work, and that was how that happened a lot of times. People weren't yelling at each other in the streets. They went back and forth in the newspaper. So anyway, they found these different controversies, and then they gave it to me, and I was like, oh my goodness, now I have to try and write this up. And so I did the best I could, sort of, pulling these different stories together. And so it was a powerful moment because my students they were much more serious than I thought they were. And they did an excellent job sort of pointing out what was important and what they thought was important to the students of the time.
Yeah, I think it was great reading that. And it's one of the things that surprised me too, all this discussion about gender and race and other things that were happening that you wouldn't associate with this campus immediately. So, as you said, it wasn't about donkey basketball.
Yeah, right.
Silly stuff going on. Can you tell us, where can people find your book?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find it on Amazon, but also you could buy it directly from Penn State University Press. It was printed under the Behrend College imprint, which is great. We have our own book imprint. But Penn State University Press did an awesome job helping us produce the book and get it out. And they came up with a lot of the cover artwork and stuff like that. So you could buy it directly from the press.
It looks great. It's an easy read.
Great. And that's not because a lot of research and work didn't go into it. It's just
no, it's not that it's simple. It's just, but of course, I have a vested interest.
Absolutely.
Once you
Pick
sit
it up.
down, you can read it, and I found it very readable.
Yeah, buy a copy for yourself and 100 of your best friends.
There we go. So let's switch and talk again about your teaching, and how would you? I like to ask this question. Like, what's your philosophy like in teaching, and what are you trying to achieve in the classroom with students?
That's a great question, and as someone who has probably spent too much time thinking about it, and many of us have, it's a difficult one to answer. I want to form a connection with the students. I think that's the first thing you have to do to get them to learn. So I think there has to be like a human connection there where I know their names, we're all comfortable speaking in the classroom, all of that. I want them to find history to be fun and dynamic, which is a change for a lot of them who come out of a high school where they've just been memorizing names and facts and all of that stuff. And I want to keep it fairly simple. A lot of my classes are taken by students who are trying to check a general education box. So there's a lot of engineers, business students, science students, nurses, folks like that. So I want them to come away. My goal is if you come away from each class learning one thing, that's a huge accomplishment. And if you come away from the whole class, as long as you go into your life and you can you remember a couple things, a year down the road, 2 years from now down the road, that's huge for me. So that's really like at its most basic level, that's what I'm trying to achieve in the classroom with them.
So if I take that a step further, then what do you want them to think about your class 10 years later? So do you ever think about that? Like, what do you hope they took away as the big life lesson?
Yes. And I have thought about it for years now, not as a teacher, but I remember when I was a student, there was a lot of things I learned as an undergraduate student that didn't click until I was in my mid-20s, my late 20s, where you're sort of like, someone put the part in the machine, but it only just now sort of clicked, into place. And so I think first off, it's a huge accomplishment if anyone leaves this place and 5 years later, they remember my class and remember me as a professor 5-10 years later. I think that's great. And then I hope they have like a positive feeling about it. And like I said, if they remember one or two things, that's great. I can't tell you how many college classes I took where I don't remember anything. I don't remember the professor's name. I don't remember what they look like. It was just a blur. And it was not because of the extracurricular fun, I will say.
Yes, it was.
It's just there's certain things that your mind retains. And it's usually the experiences that you felt like were fun experiences, positive experiences, where you felt comfortable in the classroom. And that's why all that stuff, which doesn't seem like it has anything to do with history, I think is so important to actually teaching history.
That's if someone remembered you 5 years later and they learned a lesson, and they will. And by the way, many students here they remember your classes. My kids went through your classes.
Well,
So I can say that, my two sons.
That's
you may not even know that. You probably forgot their names.
Yeah, I mean, probably.
But let's talk about the history program. So you're a member of the history program here, faculty member, and we have a bachelor's degree in history. Why should someone come here and study history?
Well, I think there's all sorts of reasons why you might study history. We have different spiels, that we give at these open houses. But for me, I think it's important that students, if someone loves history, I see this as an opportunity for them to continue that education. And then, when you get out of this place, we as a program are sure that you will be prepared to do whatever you really want to do. That excludes, narrow, for sort of very specialized fields. But we have history majors that are in everything from like law enforcement and government work to obviously working in museums and teaching to selling insurance and working, for large corporations. So the way that we try and prepare our students is we want to teach them some skills like writing, speaking, they can do research, stuff like that, but that we're trying to teach them how to think. as opposed to just sort of what to think. Again, going back to the, high school, you're memorizing stuff. Here we want to teach you the fundamentals of how to think, how to have dynamic interpersonal relations with people. And I think history teaches you how to do a lot of that stuff. And the biggest thing, of course, is we want you to be empathetic. We want to teach you this skill. Empathy is like a little muscle in your brain that you have to sort of pump it up. And the way that you pump it up is by teaching people to walk in other people's shoes, see the world from different perspectives, and all of that. But I always go back to, if you love history, this is your last chance to learn about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, we are coming to the end of the interview.
Sure.
I will give you the last word. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
There's not a ton other than, Vision and Resilience was a great learning experience for me. And I think that people who pick up this book, whether they're in higher ed or they're interested in our college, I think it will hopefully give them a pretty accurate view of what happened here, and not just what happened, but why things happened in this place. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. My guest today is Dr. Joe Beilein. You have been listening to Behrend Talks.